Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Rabble Report.
What's the first thing you think of when you hear the name Henry Kissinger? If your answer is war criminal, you're probably not alone. But there's also more to learn about the old gnome than you might think. Today we're talking about the connection between Kissinger and anti-politics, tracking how and why, late in Henry Kissinger's life, he became increasingly dissatisfied with the political elites that came after him and inherited the US-led world order he dedicated his life to. Today we have special guest Anton Cebalo. Anton, tell us about your background and your interest in this topic.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Anton. I have a MA in history. And yeah, we've been talking about Henry Kissinger. Actually, we were collaborating on an essay together, and it just so happened that he died around that time, which was a funny coincidence, but he was 100 years old by the time he died. And ever since then, we've been thinking about how Kissinger is a vehicle for understanding how the attitudes of political elites have changed in the last 50 years. And especially by the time Kissinger died, he was disliked by many elites who previously, maybe even 10 years ago, would have actually admired him openly and publicly. But even on his 100th birthday, there was controversy over even attending. So it just goes to show how attitudes towards Kissinger have changed. And I think that has a lot to do with how attitudes within the state and the leadership class has also changed. So I think by discussing Kissinger, you can better understand the transformations at the elite level in the American state.
Yeah, about 3 years in the make having some kind of project out on Henry Kissinger.
Right. Henry Kissinger, most people who know anything about him really know that Henry Kissinger, that you think of him as a pretty establishment guy. He's a very institutional figure in American politics. Even if you don't know a lot about him, you know Henry Kissinger, foreign policy, geopolitics. But he became very opposed to the establishment consensus on Ukraine and COVID because they scared him. Both of those crises kind of scared him, the way that they were managed. And we'll come back to all that. But it is very interesting. For most of his life, a very well-respected American statesman. But by the time of his death, President Xi Jinping of China had more positive things to say about him in a statement than the American president, Joe Biden.
It's weird, too, because what I think is interesting is how fast that is star fell for the American politics. Because as late as 2015, 2016, you have Hillary Clinton praising him on stage, also getting rebuffed by Bernie Sanders.
He became an object of embarrassment for Clinton on that debate stage with Bernie Sanders. Sanders said something along the lines of, "I don't take advice from Henry Kissinger," which got at some of what really was toxic for Hillary Clinton at the time. It shows that politicians were becoming more comfortable criticizing Kissinger.
And the thing with Kissinger, too, is that it's less about Kissinger. It's more about how Kissinger lets us see how elite opinion has changed over time and how politicians see themselves. But to understand what made Kissinger and his worldview and why that worldview ran past him, you have to understand the circumstances in which he was born. He was born in Germany in 1923 and fled Germany after the Nazi takeover to the United States. He joined the American war effort. He was considered an exceptional student at Harvard in the late 40s to early 50s, and he wrote his thesis on philosophy of history and why empires rise and fall. He would eventually enter American politics, advising different politicians about foreign policy. He worked for the Rockefeller campaign, but really most people know about him through his involvement with President Richard Nixon, who would win the election of 1968. And they would form a partnership that would become very consequential for relations between China and the United States, for relations in Vietnam, and also for detente between the Soviet Union and the United States. Kissinger became pretty much a mainstay in American political life, especially amongst elite circles. He was a consultant for every American president, with the exception of Joe Biden.
Do you think World War II influenced his thinking?
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So the reason I think Kissinger is so different from the current crop of political elites we have today is that they were born in completely different eras. So Kissinger viewed the destruction of Europe in his time, World War II, and all that was left after World War II. He viewed this as evidence that nothing should be taken for granted, basically. Power is inherently unstable, and there has to be an active maintenance between other powers to maintain a sort of equilibrium. And he developed his worldview, which can basically be summed up as realpolitik. It's not really about values, it's about the balance of powers and negotiating that balance through backroom deals, proxy wars, whatever is needed, but just to keep that balance in check so that the world doesn't fall into chaos, basically. A lot of his training while an undergraduate and as a graduate student was very concerned with what you would call like big meta historical questions. So he very much fashioned himself as a philosopher, but he also was not afraid to recommend using force. So actually, a lot of his early books in the 60s, and he was perhaps most famous for this before he joined the Nixon administration, was his advocacy of using tactical nuclear weapons as a way to dissuade smaller states to keep foreign powers in check. He is very much willing to use the stick and to strike fear in others so that that balance is maintained.
Kissinger infamously involved in overseeing the bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War.
So the thing with Kissinger, too, is that his position as a realpolitik, his worldview, was never even the dominant worldview in the U.S. government. So he, even in the Nixon administration, when he was the leading consultant, he constantly butted heads with people who thought the fight with communism was a values-based existential threat. And here he was proposing relations with the Soviet Union. He proposed opening up relations with China.
I do find it very interesting that Kissinger wrote about Oswald Spengler, actually, as an undergraduate, because Spengler was a philosopher of history that viewed the rise and falls of civilizations in these sort of cyclical ways. And I think that speaks to Kissinger's sort of central worldview about the decline of powers and how that related to American power after World War II. And
right. And one of the reasons Kissinger and Nixon get along so famously is that they both are more realistic about the limitations of American power in some ways. I mean, they both are kind of declinist oriented. And that does have some saturation in the American government. Anton, you can probably speak to that a little bit about that as an emerging fear of communism overtaking the United States on the earlier end of the Cold War and how that informed Kissinger's views.
The Soviet Union really was growing at a rapid rate. And additionally, also, there were a lot of reports coming out in the 60s that potentially the Soviet Union could eclipse or could reach an American standard of living by the 1970s. And to us now, knowing what happened, this might sound a little bit absurd, but the reality was that there was a palpable fear amongst American elites that the USSR could pass the United States. And Kissinger was definitely an individual who said that this was a serious threat.
Typically, we think of the post-war boom, and there's a lot of truth to that for the United States and the great position that the U.S. was in. But still, in 1962, how do you explain that Kissinger says 15 years more of a deterioration on our position in the world, as we have experienced since World War II, would find us reduced to Fortress America in a world in which we had become largely irrelevant? So there's two stories happening in the post-war. And there's a reason we tell one and not the other now. But there was a lot of anxiety, which I think you're getting at. Even stuff like making contact with China, opening relations with China, that's seen as a triumphalist move now. But opening relations with China was about accepting limitations, accepting the need for equilibrium between powers. It was a moment where the United States realized it had to broker deals to maneuver.
Yeah, and I think also with these anxieties, I mean, the 1960s was definitely something like the peak of them. And so Nixon wins the election in 1968. And initially, Kissinger does not like Nixon at all. They're not aligned, but Kissinger eventually becomes Nixon's national security advisor. And from then on, you have a relationship that is where Nixon speaks the declinism to the people in a way. He talks in the language of that. And Kissinger is like the whisperer of the elites spreading this fear of decline and the need to act on it now so America can maintain its position. And through their relationship, you have a complete upending of American foreign policy, which was revered pretty much in all foreign policy circles, and Kissinger was consulted regularly after his tenure with Nixon.
It even sort of explains the contradictions around Nixon and Vietnam, because Nixon is both a Vietnam War conductor and a sort of peacemaker of Vietnam at the same time in his legacy. It's kind of a mixed thing. And some of those contradictions are that Kissinger did want out of Vietnam. Kissinger wanted to transfer more of the war effort over to the South Vietnamese army, but he wanted to do it in a way that left America with credible authority. That was this idea of an honorable exit that came about. And so there's these moves towards peace, but he wanted us to leave with authority and was willing to do anything to get there. Actually, the need to manage the optics of decline and the optics of withdrawal and the optics of pullback, it actually reminds me of Obama rolling back the war on terror, or Trump relating to U.S. decline in his very optics management way. Do you guys see a relationship between the declinism of Nixon, Kissinger, and today?
Yes, I absolutely do. Actually, it's interesting that that Kissinger and Trump even had some exchanges. It makes me wonder, actually, if Kissinger was more in contact with Trump than he was with Biden by the end. I really started noticing him being critical when he was conferring about COVID, actually very early on. This article from April 3rd, 2020, that he wrote for the Wall Street Journal called The Coronavirus Will Forever Alter the World Order. And later he was interviewed in a German newspaper and elaborated his thoughts about the vaccine rollout and how that could potentially botch things politically in 2021. But this 2020 article is actually quite interesting because it's rather measured and restrained compared to most of what the political establishment was saying at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's very early on. Politicians were still getting an approval boost from promising to manage and control the virus. And he saw COVID as a crisis of legitimacy for the political class, despite that surge of authority that they were experiencing by promising to contain the virus. And we know how that went. The polling on political trust goes from very low to brief boost to even lower than the very low it was at before the pandemic. He argues that political trust was under threat and that it could lead to more mistrust long term. And that wasn't because he was anti-lockdown per se, or even anti-vaccine, but he ended up kind of coming across skeptical of the response pretty early on, just because of how much politicians had promised in terms of the ability not just to reduce deaths, but to really control and contain the virus.
Yes, and he also seems concerned about what it meant for states in terms of rupturing the world's political order.
That's very true, right? Like the free flow of products, goods, people across borders is a very bedrock thing of the world liberal order. And so globalism, essentially, global cooperation ended. And even in a pandemic response sense, global coordination ended in the way that the World Health Organization sort of fell apart. The idea of internationally coordinating the virus response became impossible, and every country sort of retreated into its borders and pursued its own policy in a sense.
Right, and he saw that as an affront actually to the liberal order.
He's very anxious about this point in particular, about the social contract being very frayed. And if you look back to polling done on public trust before COVID, 2019 indicates was the highest level of public distrust in institutions up until that point. Democratic discontentment was very high across all Western democracies. So COVID emerged on the scene in a really fragile environment. And Kissinger viewed this as an opportunity both to amend, to make that better, to improve that situation, but he also understood that it would potentially blow it open.
Right. He even says in the article that it could be, quote, a global retreat from balancing power with legitimacy. And that's not because he's humanitarian about lockdowns or something like that, but he just fears that it could all create grounds for, quote, the social contract to disintegrate both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, and I think if you glean from Kissinger's writing, he really links those two together. So he views a domestic situation as intimately connected to the international situation. So you can't have a balanced international order without a social contract between elites and the public that's also balanced.
Right. One of Kissinger's complaints about the elite that comes up is that they just look like self-interested politicians now. And that's more about the illusion of democratic representation than anything. Does it mean that people were perfectly, properly represented by politicians during Kissinger's heyday? We'll leave that to the viewer to say. But he's seeing, in a way, that political classes are going inwards.
And I think this actually gets to a core point of why we find Kissinger so interesting, because although there is a primacy of foreign policy in his worldview, he does see geopolitics, at least having some relationship to domestic politics. And by having the world political class align on this response, it throws everything out of whack.
Kissinger at least recognizes a crisis of legitimacy going on, right? While everybody else is sort of barreling into this thing.
Yeah, that's where I think he really struck a nerve with them, because his criticisms really got at the core of you can't even govern. So he basically strikes at their egos in a way.
There was a lack of control.
But don't you get the feeling also that a lot of politicians like Cuomo or something, they really relished the idea that they held the keys? They were like, okay, your destiny is in my hands now.
One of the reasons that this kind of broke their backs in a way, and why they were so tempted to overpromise their ability to contain, control, fix the problem of the pandemic, has to do with the existential crisis that elites were feeling. Because, I mean, we're talking about Kissinger as a rare exception in terms of being able to articulate these things. But I do think broader elite sentiment through things like fear of populism was, by 2019, very aware of their precarious position in relationship to the public. And I think they realized that if they didn't put on the mask of we've got this under control, that it could create a lot of problems for them, or at least that's what they thought. It ended up creating problems anyway. I don't know if there was a way out of that politically.
Yeah, Grant, definitely. And like I previously mentioned, in 2019, the Center for Democracy released a study which found that 2019 was the highest year of democratic discontentment on record across all Western democracies. So there was definitely a moment in 2020 with COVID hitting that, okay, now is the time for them to be the heroes again.
Acquiescence by society to all of the emergency powers that came out of COVID were because they promised to control the virus. They said that it could be eradicated. That was what all the rhetoric revolved around. And even the idea that it would become endemic was kind of seen as like a cruel thing to say or to point out, really. And then the Omicron wave came post-vaccination and just spread, and you saw a very sudden pivot away from COVID politics take place, which gets to what Kissinger also was saying about vaccination. Because in that April 2021 interview, he says, to return to the question of political stability, if vaccination successfully reduces the incidence of the disease, then the pandemic will be perceived mostly as a health problem that was overcome. The danger is less that emergency measures taken to fight the pandemic will persist than that if infections remain high for a prolonged period on either side of the Atlantic, we would then witness a crisis of confidence in leaders and institutions. And I'm not even making a statement about whether the vaccine reduced, you could say the vaccine reduced disease incidence, but Omicron showed that it was not preventing transmission, even though they were sort of sold that way. If Kissinger's saying infections remaining high for a prolonged period means a crisis of confidence in leaders and institutions, well, infections remained high for a prolonged period.
It seems that everything that he predicted could go wrong did go wrong.
He was pretty prescient about some of these things with COVID. What do you think about going back to that conversation about Ukraine? This article in The Spectator titled How to Avoid Another World War, where he argued for Ukraine giving up territory to end the war. And this was in, I believe, 2022. He argued that the war should be for Ukraine's national sovereignty, but not prolonged by Western leaders just to try and degrade the Russian state capacity. And, it was very unpopular, this idea of giving up territory.
Yes, that's changed a little bit recently in Ukraine, but it was at that point seen as unthinkable because we have reached a point where there is sort of a head full of steam that Ukraine could win a war outright against Russia.
Right. Really, if Ukraine had gone to the negotiating table with the leverage it had at the time that Kissinger was recommending, they would have probably had a chance of a better deal than it looks like they may get now. I mean, things are still very up in the air, and it's possible the war will even drag on.
Yeah, early on in the war, there was definitely an opening to negotiate a peace settlement. Yeah, I mean, Ukraine would have to relinquish some territory, but Ukraine had a very strong position because the Russians were kicked back from Kiev and also though around the area of Kharkiv. So they essentially were in retreat, and Ukraine had quite a bit of leverage at that time, in which work when Kissinger was writing. The thing is, though, I think a lot of the sentiment around that time has been a little bit memory hold because there was a very triumphant narrative in the press that Ukraine could go all the way and completely not even take back its territory, but potentially even destroy Russia or depose Putin. Kissinger actually talks about this in the piece.
I do remember that.
Yeah, he warns that the dissolution of Russia or destroying its ability for strategic policy, would be more trouble than it's worth, basically. And that this temptation to wage this war of attrition over it, which there were even reports that some of the early peace talks that were looking promising were undermined by Western leaders basically telling Zelensky, no, now is not the time to go to the table.
I think it was around March 2022, there was talks at Istanbul, and Ukraine was feeling intense pressure from Western leaders to continue the fight, even though they had a lot of leverage in ending this war at that moment. Boris Johnson took a trip to Kiev to meet Zelensky. You also had a lot of House and Senate Republicans, including many prominent Democrats, go to Ukraine to meet Zelensky with this open goal of wanting the war to be prolonged. And so Kissinger really found himself on an island with this position. He had very few allies in this time, which only further added to his becoming like a pariah-like figure in the foreign policy establishment, which is incredible considering how important he was just 5-10 years ago. I think he viewed the coordinates of the global stability of the global order as China, Russia, United States. And for him, for the United States to be waging pretty much a direct existential war with Russia through Ukraine, it didn't make sense in his conception of what a balance of powers was supposed to be.
So actually, what I find interesting too is he winds up conceding that Ukraine would have to join NATO after the war ends. He kind of saw it as a foregone conclusion, I think, but was willing to prosecute the war only to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, as you said, and eventually cede some territory to Russia. But this was seen as sort of a morally shocking abdication of our responsibility position in 2022. Whereas now it almost seems like a great deal for Ukraine. I think what's also interesting is before it looked like Ukraine was actually going to hold up for the long run, the Pentagon was pretty much preparing for Ukraine state collapse and arming partisans. It's like they're preparing for a Ukrainian mujahideen or something. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, that's the funny thing too, is that even though the United States political class became very invested in the Ukraine war after it became clear that Ukraine would survive for some time, at first, they had absolutely no faith in the Ukrainians. I mean, that's also a very forgotten element of this. The Ukrainian resolve and survival, as long as it has lasted, took the West by surprise.
Yeah, but this is, I think, where you get into a tricky situation because American firepower is being stretched pretty thin. So it's not even like the U.S. has enough reserves to go around. It was like a difficult decision for him because I think now he kind of has to double down on Ukraine again, when there are other possible military entanglements that are happening globally. And so you're in a situation right now where the U.S. power is stretched pretty thin. And he gets back at Kissinger's whole idea of how in his realpolitik world, there has to be some equilibrium and balance. And right now, it's precisely that unraveling that creates a cascading effect on virtually every front that America is fighting on.
Also the willingness, or the unwillingness really, to play other powers off against each other. Kissinger promoted a balance of power that wasn't pursued under the Biden administration at all. Instead, you wound up pushing China and Russia together, rather than the classic Kissinger move of kill Russia or kill China off and pit them against each other.
Right. That was even called a reverse Kissinger in foreign policy circles, this alleged Trumpian strategy of aligning with Russia to contain the rise of China. And according to some people, that was even Kissinger's advice for Trump, was to make nice with Russia in order to drive a wedge with China.
Yeah, I think Trump attempted that when he won the presidency again, especially with the spat with Zelensky in the White House. There was maybe some hope in the Trump administration of a detente with Russia, but now it seems like things have fallen apart again, and with Putin increasing strikes on Ukraine again, the war has become as deadly as it's ever been in the past few months. So pretty much that whole period of Trump's first few months where he attempted to create detente with Russia has fallen on its face. And now really has no choice but to rearm Ukraine again. So he's stuck in pretty much the same position that Biden was in, except less willing. He's kind of forced into it now.
What I find interesting too, actually, tying this back with COVID, there's a sort of seamless moral crusading transition between COVID and Ukraine. Because, I mean, and obviously they're not come out of deep concern for Ukraine. I mean, I think when I was talking about earlier about Pentagon's position early on, I think that sort of highlights that. So what really motivated that pivot from COVID to Ukraine? Or what drove it?
It did feel, especially between, I don't know that I feel this way about now. Now it sort of feels like, all right, we need to calm things down. But it felt like from 2020 until late Biden administration that there was this need for crisis in some sense, that political classes needed conflict or crisis to justify their existence. And I'm not saying, for example, that there isn't a legitimate cause for Ukrainian sovereignty, or even that there wasn't a need for some pandemic response, not the one we had, but a pandemic response. But the zeal and the moralizing and the shame and the whole vibe of those years was not just about the stated aims. There was an intense sort of using the just causes that they were picking up to sort of launder their relationship with the public in a way. I imagine the invasion of Ukraine on the Russian side probably had something to do with COVID as well. I think there's elements of Zelensky as an anti-politician that freaked Putin out, and there's the longer term NATO expansion issue. But I also think Russia must have been put into some kind of position itself by the COVID regime.
Yeah, that's actually a good thought experiment. Imagine if the Ukraine war didn't happen.
There would have been more of a public reckoning with the failure of the COVID response, potentially.
Or another crisis at the rails. Because I don't think it was conscious, I agree with you, but there was, I think, a sort of secular drive towards some type of derailment. A reckoning would have been very bad for them.
Right, because it also felt like deterrence was really absent from the Biden administration's response to the Russian mobilization to invade Ukraine. I have to admit, I didn't think it was going to happen because of the way they were talking about it, but not really doing the normal things the state does to try and stop that kind of thing. I don't know the behind the scenes story. I don't know what kind of diplomacy they were trying to engage in, but to me, it's much different than, I think Trump would have given Putin a call and said, I'm going to blow up your house.
Yeah, it wasn't particularly aggressive. It wasn't like the U.S. really threatened Russia either.
No, they made it very clear that they would sort of play by the rules that have been played by, which I'm not saying that we should have started World War III. I don't think we should have, but you have to leave some strategic ambiguity about what you're going to do in response to something like this. And it felt like they actually prioritized signaling like, no, you can invade Ukraine and we'll have a proxy war. Sounds good. See you there. Again, I'm not privy to the internals of this, so that could just be an outside perception. But even the fact that it looked that way.
Yeah, I think they were surprised almost twice in really short order. First, they were surprised about the invasion, which I think probably Blinken and Biden realistically probably did not think was actually going to happen, because a land war in Europe is just so suicidal. I mean, who would even attempt such a thing, especially since Russia has declining population numbers? It makes no logical sense that they would attempt it. but they did it anyway. So that was the first surprise. And the second surprise was they couldn't even take the country. They couldn't decapitate the government. They completely failed. It was actually embarrassing how badly they failed. So those two things really set in motion a kind of really cavalier, victorious attitude. So by the time, to bring it back to Kissinger again, by the time Kissinger is writing, and even by the time, summer 2022, there is no appetite for negotiated peace settlement because the surprise was Ukraine persisted and maybe they'll do another miracle. And now we're stuck in a quagmire.
Why don't we take things to Kissinger's book? Because I think we've covered COVID and Ukraine as examples of political class mismanagement that Kissinger saw. But I want to dive into why he thought it was happening.
I think he sees leaders as not bound by what he would call aristocratic virtues or restraint. He sees them as socially detached. And he also sees them as not grounded in a sort of humanistic education that allows them to see themselves as statespeople more than self-interested politicians. This creates other problems for the powers themselves because they're decoupled. They approach foreign policy from the standpoint of ideology and distrust. So they can't form a sort of equilibrium between powers, which is important to them, and they're bent on moral crusade.
Right. And he seems to see this as, I think this is where I would maybe get into my critique of his ideas. He isn't really able to see that politics itself is no longer capable of producing the kind of figures he's looking for in leadership. Or maybe he would agree with that sentence on its own, but the full ramifications of it, of why it's happening, I think he still would ascribe to more of the surface level causes or things that are even effects. Right. Like I think the decline in higher education, it has a basis in things we've discussed on this show before that are more long-term trends. The decline of mass politics. Kissinger is still seeing a top-down problem, but he's not seeing how actually political legitimacy was also created on the other end of the spectrum by social movements that got caught up in politics.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that he does get a trust. Here's actually an interesting quote here. Americans have grown skeptical of our elite's claims to legitimacy, not so much because it is too hard to enter the upper tier of American life, even if it is, as because those in that tier seem to be permitted to do whatever they want. The trouble, in other words, not necessarily the standards for entry, but the lack of standard upon it. Precisely because our elite does not think of itself as an aristocracy. It does not believe itself to need standards or restraints. And it goes further. Whereas 19th century aristocrats understood much would be expected of them, and the meritocrats of the 20th century pursued values of service. Today's elites speak less of obligation than of self-expression or their own advance. What is more, they are being formed within a technological environment that challenges the very qualities of character and intellect that historically have served to blind people to leaders to their people. So this guy, there's a social detachment and there's a lack of trust. But I don't think he actually makes a connection, though, that it is that distrust and that and actually that attachment that is driving this decline.
He more sees the distrust as a effect, but he doesn't really give society a ton of agency. Society is almost something that just responds mechanically, in Kissinger's view here, to what's going on in politics. So that's why colleges aren't as elite anymore. And hey, listen, I might have more respect for a politician that knows how to speak Latin than one who doesn't. But at the end of the day, the state-society relationship is broken, whether they know Latin or not.
Right. And the thing is, too, when he talked about like aristocratic virtue, much of these 19th century states were largely dominated by an elite, even like an old aristocratic elite or landed elite that's sort of enclosed itself in the political class to retain its power. Even though that's a really small group of people, they still had a basis in society that existed beyond this aristocracy. There were still interests that they're trying to represent and protect there, even if that was abstracted somewhat inherent. And of course, this precedes mass politics, as we've talked about it. But now you have a state that seems, and a political class that seems totally anything beyond itself.
He does diagnose a lot of the effects, right? But he really doesn't understand the shift in society itself. The book really is like a signal in a way. Act differently, be more like this. Like behaviorally, he's trying to change how they operate so that they can put on their masks better, effectively.
There's an unmooredness that he gets at with leadership now. And I think that's intrinsic, because if you're not, what is the purpose of politics and statecraft if you're not relating yourself to a nation or a society anymore? What is the national interest?
And that's where I like, we can discuss how earnest, arguably he's probably not, but how earnest Kissinger is in his desire for the connection with the public to be stronger. But yes, it does kind of seem like the political class today finds justification only in that perpetuating themselves. They don't really have a relationship, a civil servant relationship. And whether or not that was real before or imagined is, open discussion, but it definitely doesn't exist now.
Well, I do think that having a social base complicates the separation of it.
When there's a social base, there still is a antagonism between politics and society, but it also constrains or grounds politics in a certain way, right? Like if you think about like the left, for example, the constraint of having to represent workers actually did shape the policies proposed. Now, there's also the political interests involved that would then work those things. But now there's just a lack of reality principle for the political class entirely. And he sees this as education. He doesn't actually make the connection that the lack of groundedness comes from the disconnection from society, but he does see both. He also sees college graduates as more interested in becoming executives or activists and not really leaders in a political sense.
I mean, it's kind of like a funny way to blame it on education. If you think it through, it's such like an easy solution for him to the point where it's. I have a hard time taking it seriously.
Hey, he's a Harvard man.
Yeah. I honestly have a hard time taking it seriously, only because in the time in which he was in the state, especially during like the heyday of the Nixon administration, and what politics has become in that time up until the present, especially with the decline of the social basis of politics, but also the emergence of other moneyed interests in politics. And by that, I mean the rise of like the consultancy class, rise of campaign financing, how expensive races have become. Parties used to be funded from civil society, from members of parties. And now, starting from the 70s onward, they were funded by private donors and corporations. I mean, it is true that today's crop of political elites are definitely less impressive than they were 50 years ago. But at the same time, it's also true they're not really beholden to the public because they're not linked to them. So of course you get this crop of people.
The social elite made them more impressive.
Yeah.
Even if it was the social elite of a small class, like the aristocracy. The aristocracy was impressive. The landed class was impressive, then becoming a large chunk of the political class.
Now that we looked at this, we've seen what's insightful about Kissinger's critiques of politics or internal critiques of politics, noticing that something's wrong in the first place. And it is an interesting story. He's 100 years old at the end of his life. He doesn't have to pander as much, and he thinks that the leadership are deranged incompetence. That's quite something. But we've also kind of diagnosed the problems with his thought of there being a solution. I mean, the idea that politics can solve this problem with better education of leaders.
It does feel like fighting ideology with better ideology, doesn't it? I guess the thing is there something inherent about like moral crusading to politics, or does it get like more aggressive the more detached it becomes from the earth?
I think it becomes more obvious over time. Kissinger lived through the Cold War. Kissinger lived through the Red Scare. We can't really sit here and say that there wasn't moral crusading, but Kissinger was from a generation where you could imagine, whether it was true or not, you could imagine that the state interest had a concrete material tie to civil society. You could imagine that your interests were in some way represented in politics, in the various institutions that existed.
And actually, I do want to point out, too, in his book, he does talk about how there's moral crusading pretty much underlines a lot of American geopolitical sort of intense moralism, and Kissinger and Nixon try to stylize themselves as something beyond that. They say, like trying to actually imagine that there's a national interest they can divorce from morality and abstract causes.
This even gets to Peter Mair's ruling the void, for example, with the European Union, right? The retreat from national interest into these international institutions that are further away from society, that politicos can sort of hide themselves in, right? They're not international social interests, they're international political interests. And it's sort of like this empire of liberty idea, right, that emerged from the United States over time. The way the United States presented its bid for hegemony as a universalist cause. U.S. dominance was not just about a national interest, it was about democracy. But I think over time that can get you entangled in things that look distant from the interests of your own citizens.
Really, realpolitik is such like an elite theory in and of itself. It mystifies society and it just projects itself onto it. Like the social interest is inherent to state interest. Everything's a chessboard. Hence, the longevity of the state is the end goal.
There is something nihilistic about the old gnome.
I mean, yeah, he's bitter because his legacy is on the line. The state is embarrassing me now, and I was once a part of that. Kissinger never expressed any moral regret.
Yeah, man, I have no regrets.
Here's what I'll say. I think the left had been longing for revenge against Kissinger, but resigned itself to the fact that he would die happy. But actually, the little thing that kept him up at night at the end of the line, 100 years old, was anti-politics. It's this thing we talk about.
I think it's even how anti-politics is being responded to.
That it couldn't be responded to.
Yeah.
That's what he struggled with. I think that's what Kissinger reveals. You've got one of the smartest political operators in modern history, and he has no response to anti-politics. He can barely comprehend it.